You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, editor-at-large at The Diplomat. I'm coming to you here from New York City, and I'm delighted today to be joined by a special guest, a familiar name for those of you who keep up with The Diplomat's Asia Defense blog. Joining me today is Raji Rajagopalan, a distinguished fellow and head in the Nuclear and Space Policy Initiative at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. Raji, how are you doing today?
Doing good, absolutely, to the extent possible. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me. It's really a pleasure to have you. You're someone that I've wanted to get on the show for a long time now, given that you have been contributing regularly to The Diplomat. And actually, the topic that I had in mind for today's discussion is actually to just take stock of the U.S.-India relationship. And there's a lot of reasons that I want to do that, in particular, just reflecting on the role that the United States has been playing in sort of the backdrop of this Eastern Ladakh crisis that you and me and other people have been writing about so much, of course, at The Diplomat and elsewhere, the India-China border issue. But before we get into our conversation today, I did want to just ask you to introduce yourself and just tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and your research interests.
Sure. Thank you for that. And my name is Raji Rajagopalan. I'm a distinguished fellow and I head the Nuclear and Space Policy Initiative at the Observer Research Foundation based in Delhi. I've been here at the think tank for about 14 years almost. And prior to that, I worked with the Government of India at the National Security Council Secretariat for about 5 years. Currently, I contribute to the Diplomat's Asia Defense blog, but I am also a non-resident Indo-Pacific fellow at the Perth US Asia Center. Happy to be part of it. My research interests, broadly, I focus on Indian foreign policy, the Indo-Pacific developments, and like they say, there is never a dull moment in Asia. So there's plenty to keep us all busy on the Asian security issues, and all the major power relations in this part of the world.
Indeed, there's never a dull day in Asia. That's very well put.
Absolutely.
Let's get into this a little bit. So listeners, I'll have a link to Raji's last column in the show notes. She wrote a little bit about the U.S.-India relationship in the context of not just the ongoing India-China Himalayan border dispute, but just a good way to just take stock of where things are, or at least have been left in the first half of 2020. So Raji, I wanted to just ask you to just sum up the basic of your argument. You make the case that U.S. support for India is really a lot more overt now. And, the comparison you used, which I think is the right one, is the 2017 summer Doklam standoff, which was, I think, the most serious recent standoff before, obviously, the Eastern Ladakh thing blew the lid off of everything and we saw fatalities on June 15th, unfortunately. So tell us a little bit about why you think that's the case.
No, I think over the last few years, U.S.-India relations have been growing from strength to strength. There have been a greater momentum. And I would say, at least in the first half of this year, it's been mostly driven by China and the pandemic. And both have helped, in a sense, the coming together of India and the major Indo-Pacific powers. But the U.S. has been key. And I think the stark contrast is the Doklam crisis, when the U.S. did not even come out with a standalone statement on the thing. But again, that's possibly because India did not expect or want a statement of that kind, because India would have assumed that it would complicate its the management of the conflict at that point of time with China, and therefore India possibly did not seek such kind of assurance from the U.S. side. But I think the U.S. was also relatively didn't want to get into the middle of two Asian big powers. But I think over the last year, there have been a lot more that's been going on with China pushing its a very aggressive behavior in the Indo-Pacific region that has pushed not just the neighbors, but also a use of economic coercion against Australia, or even pushing countries such as Canada, Sweden, so on and so forth. So there's been nobody who has been spared in the last few years in terms of the Chinese behavior. And I think that's been, so today, US and India are increasingly on the same strategic page when it comes to ensuring that Asia remains sort of a multilateral place, but certainly does not want to see an Asia that is going to be dominated by one single power. And I think this has been an objective on the US side as well as on the Indian side. It has been reiterated several different times by Prime Minister Modi, when the current foreign minister, when he was the foreign secretary, but also as the external affairs minister, Dr. Jaishankar has also repeatedly talked about this as to how India wants to ensure that Asia is not hegemonic. Asia is not dominated by one single power, and I think there in that context, I think there is a convergence of interest both between India and the US, and I think that's what we are seeing. And there are several other issues that come into play that takes the relationship forward. But I think the the big objective for both countries remain that Indo-Pacific region, the Asia remains a non-hegemonic space in a sense, strategic space.
No, that's a really great scene setter. I want to dig into a few things you said. I mean, so the most interesting point initially, I think, that you made is that this notion that India may not have actually wanted public expressions from the United States, and I think that's important because particularly in Sino-Indian crises, India has generally preferred to manage things in a bilateral context without the United States really inserting itself in a big way. So during Doklam, that certainly seemed to be the case. And of course, in the aftermath of Doklam, we had the Wuhan and Chennai summits and this Indian attempt to really right the ship with India. Of course, the Eastern Ladakh crisis is completely different in terms of magnitude. So my question there is, from your perch in New Delhi, does it seem like something's changed now in terms of how India views overt statements by the United States in its support, right? I mean, just on even on Twitter, Mark Esper made this comment that the U.S. is watching things in Eastern Ladakh very closely, which I found interesting. So what's your... Yeah.
No, absolutely. I think the US has been watching the developments very closely, even before the June 15 incident that happened that killed 20 Indian Army personnel. The US has been fairly loud and clear in its support for India and the kind of anti-China sentiment that played out. But I think in the post-Galvan clash with casualties, which has been a phenomena after almost like 4 decades now, there has been a big shift even in the Indian mood, at least in terms of the public perception. Of course, there is a lot of anger and antagonism towards China. But even if you look at the Pew survey and any other survey that have been done, anti-China sentiment has always been there. It may not be, the scale of it may be very different, but I think the support for China has not always been particularly forthcoming. If you were to compare that with the favorable attitude towards the US, you can see how unfavorable has China been looked at. But I think today you see a bigger difference in terms of the elite opinion, because elite opinion has not been particularly favorable towards all the way favorable to the US, but certainly they had a much more nuanced approach to China, a very much a balanced approach towards China. That is today changing. In fact, many of these senior officials who were leading the China portfolio for a very long time, Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, for instance, who has handled the Minister of External Affairs, but also was the ambassador to China, called for a fundamental relook at India's China's policy, and he has called for making big changes and to implement those changes at the earliest, even if India has to go through some pains in terms of economic and other aspects. And the most surprising has been, for instance, the former Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale, who has come out in a number of columns, again, has a particularly antagonistic approach towards China, calling for, again, a shift in Indian foreign policy. Former Foreign Secretary and the National Security Advisor Shiv Shankar Menon, again, has talked about how the current situation is very different. China is no more the same, and how serious the situation it has become. So I think there has been increasing number of calls to reassess India's China policy, and I think we are not averse to looking at or embracing the US and other Indo-Pacific partners in taking China on head on, in a sense. So there is that public anger has always been there, or a certain amount of unfriendly attitude towards China, but that had never translated to elite opinion. But today you are seeing a change in that elite opinion on China.
Yeah, no, that's a useful way to think about this. Set aside the constants and the variables. Although I do think public opinion has varied in some important ways, but of course it makes a more permissive environment domestically. You also see the opposition parties, for instance, criticizing the BJP for not doing enough on China, which is also an interesting dynamic during this crisis.
Absolutely.
But that's Indian politics always. It's not necessarily specific to this crisis. So. All of that, I think I agree with and makes a lot of sense. I wanted to ask you about, so what are really a lot of people have been writing about what India's options are. There's been this
Sure.
discussion about what India can actually do along the border in eastern Ladakh and in Arunachal Pradesh and a few other areas along the line of actual control. That's not really what
Sure.
I'm so interested in with talking to you about.
Yeah.
What I'm more interested in is sort of at the strategic level, what more should India be doing to really,
Okay.
compete with China more effectively?
So I'll come to that in a minute, but I also wanted to add. So having said that, you have had folks like Ambassador Bombawale and Shiv Shankar Menon talk about certain shift in Indian foreign policy, but there has also been very late in the day some shift, certain amount of pushback from today. For instance, you had the National Security Advisory Board, the head of the NSAB, Ambassador P.S. Raghavan, writing on the importance of the RIC, the Russia, India, China trilateral. So he actually makes a stronger case for the trilateral to be continued as an important pillar in India's foreign policy. He says that you cannot completely disengage from China as well, and that you need to work with them. So I do see, even maybe there is a pushback because there is a sense that, or maybe we went a bit too much in pushing for India-US or India's embracement of the Quad countries and so on and so forth. And therefore, it appears that there is a pushback because of that aspect in a sense. And of course, the Indian Defense Minister went to Russia for the Victory Day parade. Then there was a RIC summit, the virtual foreign ministers meeting that happened. So in a sense, India is still, it appears that it's still not very clear. There seems to be a certain amount of waving, fluctuations in India's approach. It's not very clear as to how we are going to take forward, how we are going to deal with the China challenge, and how and where we place the Quad and the broader Indo-Pacific partners. On the other hand, where you have the RIC, the BRICS, and the NAM. Because after several years being in power, Prime Minister Modi never attended the non-alignment movement summit, for instance. But this year he decided to take part in the virtual summit. So India does seem to be sending very confusing signals at some point in terms of where we are, what is our long-term approach in terms of addressing the China problem in a sense. Because the China problem is here to stay. We seem to have taken at this point of time certain economic and non-strategic steps in dealing with the China post-Galvin clash. So one was for instance, Indian government's decision to ban the Chinese app. I think we banned about 59 Chinese apps. So that was one step that we took. And I think it has a larger implication in terms of how we are trying to keep the Huawei, and India has still not taken a decision on the 5G network. But I think it is sending a clear signal that we are not going to be entertaining Chinese companies, even in the trial process and so on and so forth. So the certain amount of. And then, of course, India went about amending the FDI rule to avoid certain opportunistic takeovers of the companies and so on and so forth, the post-COVID scenario. Then, of course, slightly on the defense side, you have a major naval deployment that has been happening towards the Malacca Straits, so that we avoid any surprises on that front. But I think at this point of time, we are still not seeing very much in terms of India pushing back in an offensive fashion. But I think it is difficult to undertake offensive operations in the mountainous areas. And also Indian Army's approach has been largely defensive oriented military approach it has had. So it's going to be very difficult to undertake an offensive operation against China. So if China attacks, we will fight, but I think using force to redress this current situation, I don't see India gearing up to doing that actually at this point of time.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's that old, I guess, cliche at this point that, an elephant doesn't make sharp turns. That's often used to describe India's consistency in foreign policy. But I think it's interesting that you've, this idea that there is sort of a revision at the strategic elite level of the approach towards China is, I think, quite convincing. And of course, it's happening in many Asian countries, not just India at this point, which is quite interesting as well. I want to ask you a little bit about Russia because you brought up Russia, and I think that's something that makes a lot of sense. And I know in the In the U.S. discussions today about the relationship with India, Russia looms large. I mean, for very
Yeah,
practical reasons, primarily being the legacy defense relationship with India. If you
sure.
look at the cumulative totals, the U.S. has been doing better as an export source for
Absolutely.
Indian defense material in recent years. But the Cold War
Yeah.
legacy looms large. India still needs access to Russia for maintenance and logistics for the systems that it maintains today. So, cutting off ties with Russia or significantly revising that relationship is simply not practical for India.
Yeah.
And of course, Russia has geopolitical preferences of its own. It's not as forward leaning as the United States or China might be on India. But
Sure.
like you said, Russia would certainly prefer that India not fall entirely into the United States sphere of influence, so to speak, in Asia. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
what's your take on the U.S.-Russia relationship today? I mean, is what I said basically your understanding, or is there more nuance to this?
No, Russia for India, I think it's a big puzzle because I think India does not want to see a Russia that is growing closer and closer to China, because having that huge Eurasian landmass come together, I think that has huge ramifications, both in terms of the kind of science and technological capabilities, the defense capabilities, energy security, whole range of things. So the coming together of Russia and China is not particularly entertained in the Indian policy narrative. But at the same time, what is that India can do to sort of create a rift between? Does India have that power and sort of role to kind of play that kind of role? I don't think so. But I think India still continues to look at Russia from a very historical perspective and very emotional kind of a response to looking at looking at Russia. And I don't think that is particularly helpful. I believe India needs to be a lot more pragmatic, and its decisions needs to be made on national security parameters rather than historical legacy issue. So India has been trying to diversify its defense procurement for a few years now, and last few years, the US had become the largest defense trade partner with India, given the large items that we procured from the US. And that's not been particularly liked by Russia. In the meantime, what the Russians are doing has implications for India in terms of the military balance and national security. For instance, we have deployed the Sino-Indian border the Su-30 MKI, which we have procured from the Russians. But later on, the Russians have actually now supplied the Chinese with Su-30, another version of it, but also the Su-35, which are much far advanced platforms in a sense. So Russia never used to part with the better technology to China for a very long time. But all that changed sometime in 2013-14 after the Ukraine crisis and so on and so forth. So today, I wouldn't place my bet on Russia, especially if you were to look at some of the recent examples. For instance, at the UN Security Council, China took India to the UN Security Council on the Jammu and Kashmir issue. It was France and the US which stood out for India, which called out for India, which had a show of hand for India. But Russia took a neutral position there. But somehow India does not seem to, the Indian political leadership, or at least the bureaucracy, does not take the message
Mm-hmm.
that for today, for Russia, China is far too important. And if it has to make a choice between China and India, it will always go with China. But that's a recognition that has to seep into the Indian political mindset, especially the bureaucracy, the MEA bureaucracy. I don't think they are still sort of catching on that particular aspect of the new Russia that we are dealing with, in a sense.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a fascinating answer. I'd love to actually dig more into that, but possibly on a separate podcast to talk all about
Sure.
Russia. But before we close off today's discussion, I wanted to sort of also ask you about this recent speech that U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo delivered last week. Where, among other things, obviously the speech was all about China, and particularly the
Yeah.
Chinese Communist Party. And
Yeah.
one of the prescriptions, which is not really a new idea if you look at initiatives like the Quad and other things, Pompeo called for an alliance of democracies. And
Yeah.
from what's the view from New Delhi for an aggressive American proposal like this? I mean, I think there are questions about whether this would be the exact approach that, let's say, a Biden administration would choose to take. But just generally, I mean, looking at the debate in the United States on China, how does India necessarily view this notion of bringing democracies together and making democracy the organizing principle for a China containment coalition?
So many a time, I think India does not really talk as much about it, or sometimes talks which are still continuing with the old rhetoric. But I think India has to be judged based on the kind of actions that it has sought to do. And I think one of the fact that the fact that the Quad has been upgraded to a foreign ministerial level, and that shows India's commitment to the concept of Quad, and the need to kind of sort of take it to a higher level in terms of the deliberations. But I think today, post Galvan, there is a call for even moving beyond security, engaging in security dialogues and political discussions to something more, maybe more in terms of coordinated joint patrols and so on and so forth. So that's beginning to happen in the public debate in India today, and I think that's a sign of things to come. India have, I think, about 3 or 4 years ago. PACOM Commander Admiral Harry Harris talked about a joint patrol by India and the US, and immediately then Defense Minister Parikar came out and said, we do joint exercises, we do not do joint patrols. But I think today the situation is somewhat different. I think India is slowly opening up to the idea that we may have to engage in coordinated joint patrols and so on and so forth, military encouragement, military operations of that kind, and engaging not just democracies, because democracies means you would also leave out countries like Vietnam, for instance. And so I think in an effort to embrace all possible like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific, India would not be averse to using the term democracy, but I think India would prefer to use the term like-minded partners, so that it can embrace even somewhat non-democratic countries into that framework, so that we do have a serious group of countries who are willing to do a pushback on China.
Right, and when we say like-minded, the thing that these countries would be like-minded about, presumably, is China, or preserving the regional status quo, or both.
I think it's going to be both. And one aspect in this regard, and again, India has still not has made a decision on that, is the Malabar exercise, the naval exercise that now includes Japan as a permanent partner, which was traditionally India-US Malabar naval exercises, now includes Japan from 2015. India is yet to take a decision whether to let have Australia join us or not. This kite flying business is something sort of, it's very, very difficult to understand as to why India could not make a decision and come out with a statement rather than say that, yeah, we are considering that and we are making a decision. So why does India? But I think there is a greater possibility of India taking some bolder decision in this regard to engage in bringing in all the like-minded partners. One is against China, but also I think to maintaining certain amount of status quo. But even against, when you talk about sort of common concerns about China, I think there are differences in approach even within the Quad countries. For instance, for India, I think the primary concern is all about the Indonesian region and maybe some of the border areas and so on and so forth. But for the other three partners, it's the Chinese influence and Chinese increasing presence in the Pacific that is driving. But I don't see those as big stumbling blocks in having a coordinated position on a number of important issues, strategic issues in the Indo-Pacific.
Terrific. Well, Raji, that's all the time we have for today, unfortunately. But thank you so much for joining me on the Asia Geopolitics podcast.
Thank you, Ankit. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. And for our listeners, if you liked listening to Raji, definitely keep up with her column at The Diplomat. She writes at our Asia Defense channel. Her recent column was on U.S.-India relations in the context of the ongoing crisis with China in eastern Ladakh. But Raji covers a range of topics, so she's certainly somebody that I try to read as frequently as possible. So Raji, again, thanks so much, and we'll hope to have you back on soon.
Thank you, Ankit. Have a good day.
For listeners, if you've been a subscriber to the podcast but you haven't yet left us a review, we'd really appreciate if you could do that. It really helps get the word out about the show. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do so. We'd love for you to keep up with future coverage on this podcast. Finally, before we close, a quick note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.